friends are since.
Hello, today I'm going to be talking about a camera lens, specifically the Voigtlander 15mm f4.5. Now I'm sure there'll be people out there thinking, hang on a minute, I thought this was meant to be a music channel. It's called All My Friends Are Synths. Why is he talking about cameras and camera lenses? And if that's the case, I'm sorry to disappoint you. However, I happen to be a photographer before I am a musician, or at least that's how I kind of think of myself. And so cameras and camera lenses are fairly important, and I think there is a big crossover between people who make music and do videos and video art and all that kind of thing, and cameras and camera lenses, because photography and presenting things visually is a big part of kind of doing creative stuff. And so I've got a whole pile of weird lenses and cameras and stuff that I thought are worth sharing about, because if you're interested in watching lens videos, why not come and watch me talk about lenses instead? Moving on to talk about the actual lens itself, the Voigtlander 15mm is a rangefinder lens, and that means that it is specifically designed for rangefinder cameras. If you're not familiar with a rangefinder, it's basically a different way of focusing, rather than like in an SLR where you look through the camera viewfinder and you see what the lens sees. With this, you essentially focus by lining up a patch in the optical viewfinder, and that gives the correct focus in accordance with the lens. Now, this specific lens was designed primarily or solely really for 35mm rangefinder cameras, and so it's got an old mount called the M39 mount, or the Leica thread mount, depending on how you want to think about it. But this mount specifically can be found in a bunch of cameras such as the Canon 7, the Canon P, and a whole bunch of other older Leica mechanical rangefinder cameras. Obviously, you can use this lens on modern bodies if you have the correct adapter. So for example, I usually use it on my Leica M Type 240, which is a digital rangefinder, and I use an M39 to M mount adapter. They're fairly cheap and easy to find. However, you can also use it on other more modern digital bodies like Sony E mount cameras if you have an M39 to E mount adapter, and that works fairly well. Now, this is an ultra wide angle lens. It does come in at 15mm at full frame, and so if you're using it on a rangefinder, then within the optical viewfinder there isn't accommodations for an angle of that size, or a field of view at that size I should say. And so included with the lens you get a nice wee optical finder that sits on top of the hot shoe and gives you a kind of approximation of the field of view that you're going to get with the camera lens attached. If you're shooting on a digital body, this isn't as big a deal because you can obviously just use live view or something like that, and that way you'll see exactly what the camera is seeing, or sorry, what the lens is seeing. However, if you're on a film rangefinder or a digital rangefinder and you're using the optical viewfinder, then you're not going to be able to see what the actual lens sees. The maximum aperture of this lens is only f4.5, so it's not the fastest lens in the world. However, it does go up to f22 at its minimum, and this is good because it means that you can shoot outside on a sunny day without having to use an ND filter as much as you might with a kind of lower minimum aperture. And this is something that we do have to talk about a bit, because the lens doesn't allow you to attach filters either on the front or on the back, and this means that you can't install a kind of protective UV filter on the front to stop it from getting knocked, but you also can't use ND filters or any of your kind of creative, you know, red filters for shooting black and white film or anything like that at all. In order to protect the front element of the lens, because obviously without a clear filter it's a bit more exposed and a bit more at risk of getting knocks or scratches or bumps or anything like that, then there is an included permanently attached metal kind of petal hood that comes around the front of the lens, and this does help to some extent if you're kind of clattering it off walls or things as you're going past. It will protect the front element of the lens to some extent. The construction of this lens is very good, as one might expect from Voigtlander. They get a very good name for the build quality and optical performance of their lenses. The body itself is made entirely out of metal and glass, obviously, and it's got a really nice chunky feel to it. It feels premium, definitely not cheap in any way, and even though it is chunky and premium, it's also relatively light and very, very small. It is tiny, and so it's a perfect accompaniment to your rangefinder cameras, which really are meant to be light and able to be carried around and quickly grab snapshots or whatever you're doing with them. Now there's a few other specific things you should note about this lens. First of all, even though it is a rangefinder lens, it isn't rangefinder coupled, and by that I mean that you can't use the rangefinder patch within your camera to focus the lens. Really what you have to do is use zone focusing, so essentially guess the distance of your subject based on the markers that are on the lens. Of course, if you're using a digital camera, you can use live view and focus peaking and all that kind of thing to get things in focus. But if you want to use your Leica M, for example, to focus this, which doesn't have a live view screen, then you're going to have to zone focus. It doesn't have the rangefinder focusing capabilities. The other thing to note is that because this lens is specifically for 35mm film rangefinder cameras, there is an interesting and rather strange issue when you shoot it on digital rangefinder bodies, or digital bodies in general, but specifically digital rangefinders, because on the edges of the frame you get this kind of weird purple fringing, and of course this is either more or less prominent depending on the kind of situation you're in, the lighting conditions, and how you post-process your images, because obviously if you're up in the saturation of your pictures, then you're going to up the saturation of this purple fringing. So be aware of that. If you're shooting this on a digital camera, you do get this kind of artifact on the side, which is quite unusual. I've not seen it from any other lens. And if you're looking for image perfection, then this is probably not the lens for you. Now there is an updated version of this lens available. There's been a few revisions of them, I think, and whilst they kept the optical formula, they kind of updated the features. So for example, the more modern versions of these lenses have an M mount instead of an M39 mount. It also has rangefinder coupling, which means you can focus using the rangefinder patch in your rangefinder camera. And also you can install filters on the front, which is quite a big upgrade. However, be aware that the added cost of these updated lenses is considerable, and you'll pay quite a lot more for the privilege of being able to do all those bits and pieces. Now if you're watching this, maybe you're a person who shoots a video and you're wondering how this lens performs for video specifically, and of course it's a lens that you can mount on a Sony camera, and so it does shoot video fine. It's also got a nice wide, well, ultra wide field of vision, which means that it's pretty nice for video. However, there are plenty of other far cheaper, more suitable video specific lenses that you can get that are better than this. So if you're looking to shoot video and you're going to buy this specifically to shoot video, then I wouldn't bother, because you can get other alternatives that will do the job much better. Specifically, this is a manual focus lens, and so you're not going to get any of the nice eye tracking or anything like that that you do get on modern digital cameras with autofocus capabilities. But also, because there are no electronic contacts on this lens to connect to a camera like the Sony A7 for example, then it means that none of the information from the lens is really being transmitted to the body in terms of the field of view or the focal length or anything like that. So you can't use something like Catalyst Browse software to then smooth out and stabilize all your footage, which means it's not as useful as it could be. And so don't buy this if you're looking for a dedicated video lens. But if you get one for your rangefinder camera and then you want to use it for video, then that would be perfectly, it would work fine. I will now come on to talk about my experience with the lens, some of the things that I like about it and dislike about it, how I've used it, and whilst I do so, I will play through some pictures I've taken with the lens in the background so you get an idea of the kind of shots you can get with it. I picked up my copy of this lens when I was in Tokyo on a trip to Japan in 2016, and at first I was surprised that the Voigtlander lenses were cheaper in Japan, because I always thought it was a European brand. However, as it turns out, the Voigtlander brand is actually just a brand name. It is no longer a specific company that manufactures lenses. Instead, Cosina, I believe, who are a Japanese company, actually manufacture the Voigtlander lenses in Japan. So it makes sense that you can get them cheaper in Japan. Now, I got the lens specifically when I was on that trip because I found myself in situations in Tokyo where I wasn't able to capture all of the madness that was going on in the way that I would like. And if you've ever been to Japan, you'll know what I'm talking about, because everything is much bigger and crazier, and there's lots of neon and big tall buildings and everything. But the individual rooms and things are always much smaller. And so you go to bars and you're often in these wee tiny places where your 35mm lens just isn't going to cut it. And so having the ultra wide angle lens means that you can really capture much more of the atmosphere in the scene, and so that's why this lens in particular has been really useful. Talking about some of the downsides of this lens that I mentioned earlier and how I kind of feel about them. First of all, the maximum aperture is only f4.5, which is not very fast, and I would usually never buy a lens which is f4.5 because I spend a lot of time in pubs and nightclubs and dark, dingy places like Scotland in general. However, what I found with this lens is that the f4.5 maximum aperture doesn't actually matter that much because the lens is so short physically, but also because it has such a short focal length. You can really handhold this lens up to a kind of ridiculous degree, and it means that you still get sharp images far beyond what you would with a 50mm at a much longer shutter speed. So for example, I've been able to shoot this down to 1/10 of a second, which is kind of unbelievable, and that kind of negates the fact that you've only got maximum aperture of f4.5. The other thing is that when it comes to ultra wide angle lenses, you're getting so much more of the frame in that you don't really necessarily need a wider maximum aperture than f4.5 anyway, because somewhere in the scene things will be bright, and the kind of collective, presentation of what you're taking a photo of tends to negate the need for the maximum aperture, especially because with this kind of lens you're not going to be looking for ultra crazy bokeh or anything like that. It's much more about capturing the full scene rather than capturing a very small specific part with everything else blown out. So for me, the maximum aperture of f4.5 has never been an issue. The second big concern people have about this lens is that it's not rangefinder coupled, and so you can't focus it using your rangefinder camera with the rangefinder patch and everything. However, again, I haven't actually found this to be an issue at all. I usually use this in digital cameras now, although I do use it on my old film rangefinders sometimes, and so I just use the live view for that, and it means that not only do I get a really accurate representation of what the field of view actually is, but I can also focus it nicely and easily. Even when I do use this lens on my film cameras, the fact that it is such an ultra wide angle lens means that it is such an incredible amount of depth of field that you don't actually need to be particularly accurate with your focusing unless you're focusing quite close up. And that's especially the case when you're shooting at something like f8. Really, you can set it to about 2 meters and everything will be in focus apart from right in front of you. So really, the kind of lack of ability to focus using the rangefinder isn't all that much of an issue for me, and I think it would actually be quite difficult to focus on an ultra wide angle lens given how small everything would be in terms of the details with something like a rangefinder. And if you've ever shot with a rangefinder, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So really, again, it would be nice if it was rangefinder coupled, but it's not something that I'm willing to pay an extra £300 or £400 for to get the newest version. The only thing I really miss on this compared to the newer versions is the fact that I can't put a filter on it, and that's because I like to have a clear protective filter on my lenses because I am infamous for not being the most careful or precious, I think, about my camera gear. I treat it as tools to be used, and I tend to just sling a camera over my shoulder. I don't kind of, baby it or anything like that. So it would be nice to be able to have a protective filter on there. But I've had this lens for a good few years now, and it's not got any scratches or anything, so it can't be that bad, really. Finally, to talk about the infamous purple fringing on the sides. Now, this will be a big deal for some people because they want to have perfect images all the time. However, I don't really understand in that case why you would be getting an old ultra-wide angle lens anyway, but whatever. For me, the purple thing doesn't bother me at all. You can correct it in post-production, obviously. However, I can tell you that I've literally never bothered to do that because I actually quite like the purple fringing, and hear me out. The purple fringing on these images kind of reminds me of an expired film that I've shot with in the past, or film that I've fucked up the development on, to be totally honest with you. And it gives the images a wee bit of character, and it doesn't look bad particularly. I'm not using this lens for perfectly clinical shots, and so for me, it suits my kind of feeling and aesthetic to have a wee bit of discoloration, and so it really isn't a problem for me. If it is a problem for you, then don't buy the lens. or only shoot it on 35mm film cameras, whatever the case may be. Overall, I really love the Voigtlander 15. I love the field of view. I love the fact that I can take it basically anywhere and be able to get pictures even in the most cramped of situations, even in very low light situations, despite the maximum aperture of f4.5. I love how compact it is, the solid build quality, the optics are excellent. Never have any kind of complaints when I'm shooting with this lens. The only thing that kind of gets me about it is that in my head I have this thing that's too wide, and so sometimes I don't use it or take it with me because I feel like, well, it's too wide to be a general purpose lens. But in actual fact, whenever I use it, I really love the pictures I get with it because it really does give both a distinct look to the pictures, but also it gives you the ability to capture so much more of a scene. And all you have to do really is move with your feet and get a bit closer if you want to capture something, you know, a bit more specifically close to you. It's not the ideal lens for street photography, of course, but in other ways it can also be very useful, because if you just set the aperture to f8 and walk about, then you can basically grab people without them knowing they're in the scene. So it's kind of, you know, it's a toss-up there. If you've got a rangefinder camera and you're looking for a wide-angle lens, there aren't a huge number of good options out there, especially none that are at this kind of price point. And so I would 100% wholeheartedly recommend this lens to anybody who shoots with a rangefinder, whether it's a film or digital rangefinder, as long as you don't mind a bit of purple fringing. If the various different added features of the newer model appeal to you, or they're things that you think you need to have, then you can go get the updated version. If you're shooting with video, then I wouldn't recommend it unless you're getting this primarily as a rangefinder lens. And so for now, that's all I have to say. That is the Voigtlander 15. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.